So, with all of me talking and rambling on here, let's get to the really important thing. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Mr. Pieter Folkens.
Hi, everybody. I'm told we're under a time constraint. He only has so much tape in his camera, so I've got a time constraint. This entire topic, I've got 6 different lectures I've put together, all targeted to different audiences and dealing with a different aspect of it. And so we don't have time tonight to give you everything. And so at his request, we're going to be focusing on a political side of it with a little bit of the science. First time I gave it to the Minutemen Tea Party, it was the scientific side, and they had so much fun with that they invited me back for the political side. And so you're getting sort of a changed presentation that has a lot of the political side and a little bit of the scientific side. So there's a little bit of a background. I've been interested in climate academically for probably 30 years. I'm a research biologist in marine mammalogy, and I've always been interested in how marine mammals are distributed around the world, why you've got Arctic animals, warm temperate animals, tropical animals, and so on and so forth. It all has to do with different types of climates. And so being a research biologist, I'm tied into the academic side of it, and so I know what the good science is and I know what the bad science is. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of an introduction to give you a little bit of an understanding of my background in it, and then I'm going to take you into a notion that I developed probably less than a year ago. Originally, when this climate change question came up, we thought it was simply a question between this guy's science and this guy's science. But that changed pretty dramatically. Back in the 1970s, when I was first getting into this, the understanding of the historical climate was based on deep sea sediments. And as you can see here, we had ice ages and we had warm periods. We're coming out of a big ice age, and this is what it looked like over the last 4,000 years. And in 1976, the understanding was rarefied a little bit by a fellow named Rhodes Fairbridge, who did a very tight reconstruction of the sea level during what's called the period of human civilization, which is roughly the last 7,000 years. And the zero line here is where we are today. And so as you can see from this, we had periods where it was very cold, we had periods where it was very warm. This area in here is called the medieval warm period. And so there's a lot of very interesting things that we already knew going into the 1980s. Now, I hope you can hear this.
The last 9 years have been amongst the top 10 warmest in the history of the planet. There's been a 6-degree increase.
Okay, that's Ed Markey. Who knows who Ed Markey is? All right, he is the co-author of the House bill that was the climate change cap and trade, carbon cap and trade bill that was trying to work its way through the Senate. So he makes a statement that the last 9 years have been among the top 10 warmest in the history of the planet. All right, I knew already that I only have to go back 1,000 years and it was much warmer than it is now. And so I can talk for a whole hour just on the stupidity that was coming out of that member of Congress's mouth. Now, my feeling is that if you're smart enough to get into Congress and you make such a catastrophically stupid statement, it's not because you're stupid or ignorant, it's because you're being clever. What you're doing, you're talking to the masses. You're trying to convince the stupid voters as opposed to anything else. You can't be that catastrophically stupid and get yourself into Congress and get reelected several times. It's just not the way it is. So in the last few years, I've been keeping a very fine ear to what's coming out of the politicians and out of Congress. And 20 years ago, when I first started criticizing the climate change debate, and I was saying, well, wait, if you look at the bigger body of science, it says that right now we're pretty darn close to average. All right, there's nothing special about what's happening with our climate right now. But these guys kept saying it was, well, they kept ramping it up. It was the warmest in the last 1,000 years. It was the warmest in the last 10,000 years. It was the warmest in the last 100,000 years. And then here it's the warmest in the history of the planet. That's because they never got traction, so they had to keep ramping it up. So we had a very strong suspicion that it had nothing to do with the climate whatsoever. And something happened after the last Benicia Tea Party meeting and this one that now confirms what we've been suspecting for the last 5 years. And what it was is they elected a new fella who is the co-chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change working group. They're meeting in Cancun right now. And something that's kind of interesting, he says, this is quoting, "Climate policy has almost nothing to do with environmental protection." This is coming from the IPCC, the chair of the working group. Has nothing to do with climate protection. Must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. It is now, and it has always been, about redistribution of wealth, not protecting the climate. So this is the climax of the entire presentation. So I'm going to take you on a trip now. Oh, by the way, the other co-chair was a guy from Cuba. All right, that bastion of freedom and wonderfulness and so on. So that you fully understand what's going on, you can't just go up against what they're saying now. You have to understand all of the elements that go way, way back into history. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the very beginnings of any element having to do with what is at the core of this climate change discussion. And so I'm going to be going down two different paths, and I'm going to show you where they merge, how they merged, and what happened after they merged. Okay? So I'm going to be moving kind of fast because I'm on a time frame. But if there's something that you want elaborated on, raise your hand and stop me, and I'll give you a little more detail if we need to. Otherwise, I'm going to start marching through this thing very quickly, okay? So it all starts back with the notion of utopia. Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. He's talking about a perfect socio-political and legal system. He's going back 500 years ago with that notion. Now the science side of it really didn't start developing until the 1820s, where Joseph Fournier was looking at gases in the atmosphere, and he realized that there was this ability of the atmosphere to retain heat. What he described became known as the greenhouse effect, and he calculated that if we did not have an atmosphere, Earth would be significantly colder than it is now. So this was the beginnings of atmospheric science. At the same time, social science was starting to develop with Henry de Saint-Simon, in which he's playing around with this idea of a state technocratic socialism. This, he felt that the society, instead of the church, should be in a position in which they can organize society and control it. And one of his main points was the whole of society ought to strive towards the amelioration of moral and physical circumstances existence of the poorest classes. This was the beginnings of the notion of redistribution of wealth. However, in the 1840s, the term social justice was coined. And the meaning of social justice back then was that if you are working, you should be compensated fairly for that work. It was essentially an anti-slavery statement. And so the feeling here was, from Luigi Tapparelli, was that social justice meant that society should treat everyone equally if you deserve it. In other words, if you work, everybody should be treated equally. He also felt very strongly in the principle of subsidiarity, which means matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized component of authority. In other words, small government. Okay? Very important. His idea was taken to a broader audience through Antonio Rosmini, he became very controversial. He started pushing the idea of social justice to a much wider audience through his book, but he didn't emphasize the notion of local government, the small government part. He felt that the government needed to be bigger. Then working into the mid-1800s, these two guys came up with the amazing observation that some people have more stuff than others. Now, they took the Christian idea of social justice because that was a very popular notion. Society and justice, who can question that notion? But he took the idea from fairness and he made it a basis for class welfare, warfare, excuse me, not welfare, but warfare, and the notion of redistribution of property through an established powerful state. Marxism has a large centralized government, which is the single most important element in a person's life, according to Marxism. In other words, society needs to work for the state, then the state will determine who gets what. And this was at complete odds with the notion of the American experiment of individual freedom, and you should profit from your own toils and so on and so forth. So this was contrary to the notion of the American experiment. The important point I want you to remember about that part of it is that social justice started with the notion of fairness and small government. And within only 30 years, it was developed into a premise for redistribution of wealth from a powerful centralized government and a ruling elite. It's an important thing to remember. Now we get back to atmospheric sciences. In the mid-1800s, John Tyndall finds out that water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas. This became a very big argument in the last couple of decades when everybody was trying to say carbon dioxide was the thing that was driving global warming. The problem is this truth that water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas has been tested, it's been proven, it's been retested, reproven, but because the government cannot control water vapor, they instead try to get everybody to believe that it's carbon dioxide. Okay? It's a big point to remember on the scientific side. Now, the concern in the 1800s was not about global warming. The concern was about global cooling. Anybody around here remember when this painting was made? Edvard Munch's The Scream. Why is the red sky in the background? Why is that person screaming? Nobody knows? So you're getting art history in here too. A few years before the painting was made, there was this thing called Krakatoa. In 1883, Krakatoa set off, lost its top, and it had such a dramatic impact on the world's climate that there were crop failures for several years following the pyroclastic event of Krakatoa. There was starvation because of the crop failures, and all of a sudden, people who remembered historically a period of time called the Little Ice Age were very concerned that they were going to be going into another ice age. Now, the Little Ice Age, which was roughly 15th century through the 17th, 18th century, 1/3 of the European population died because of starvation and disease because of the Little Ice Age. So in the late 1800s, the concern was about getting cold. Svante Arrhenius believed that warm is better than cold. And they knew that because just a few years prior to where he started publishing his papers on the atmosphere, they actually got cold and people died because there was this sudden coolness that hit because of the pyroclastic event. And so Arrhenius was thinking that the Industrial Revolution was a good thing because it put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which caused things to warm up after the Little Ice Age, and that's why the 1800s was bringing us everything from automobiles and steam engines, and the population of the earth was exploding because agricultural production was up. The belief in the late 1800s was global warming is a pretty darn good thing. This is pretty darn special. Look how great everything is. Thomas Crowder Chamberlain produced a model for the global carbon exchange. So now the scientists are starting to put together some things saying carbon dioxide, global warming, this is good, so on and so forth. Niels Ekholm thought that the burning of coal, if they could double the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, things would be really, really great. They wanted to be able to regulate the future of the climate of the Earth to prevent a new ice age. Knut Ångström, he disagreed with Arrhenius. He said that carbon dioxide, the molecule of carbon dioxide, had a limit in terms of the amount of energy that it could absorb and or reflect. And so he pointed out that the atmosphere had already absorbed all of the long wave radiation that it could. That you could put as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as you wanted to, and it would not change the climate at all. Recent studies over the last 5 or 6 years took this idea even further and found that the radiative absorptive properties of the carbon dioxide molecule is logarithmic. Meaning you start with this amount, and if you doubled it, the effective warming would only go up that much. You double it again, and it only goes up a little bit more. It's logarithmic. So you could double, triple, quadruple carbon dioxide, and it would not have an effect on the environment whatsoever. And in fact, the observations of the last 200 years are such that the concentration of carbon dioxide has gone up. And where has the temperature been going? Flat to down. So it turns out carbon dioxide isn't so important. Chamberlain, a few years later, back in the 20s, he says, "I greatly regret that I was among the victims of Arrhenius's error. Science had found out that the role of carbon dioxide had been overemphasized and it was no big deal." This is the important point to remember. Early concern forwarded the notion of carbon dioxide being a good thing to keep us from going into an ice age. And it turns out the science has proven that it doesn't matter. Carbon dioxide does not contribute to that issue. Something else is going on. Now over on the political side, we have this guy, Francis Galton. Anybody hear of eugenics before? Okay. Eugenics, they think that they can improve the human stock by having better breeding, which is kind of an interesting notion. One of the deep ironies here is Galton was a meteorologist who pioneered the use of air pressure and air masses for predicting weather. But I'm going to expand on this a little bit, and you're going to see how it ties into the global warming discussion. In the late 1880s, had the women's suffragette movement. In England, they wanted the women wanted the vote. The guys who had the power in Parliament didn't want that to happen. And so what they did is they took a note from eugenics, and they commissioned a large scientific study. And here is what they did. I'm going to demonstrate it right here. What they did is they got a few thousand women. You're a female, you will work. And they measured the size of the cranium. About that big. Then they got a few thousand men, and they measured the cranium. And they found out that women had smaller heads than men. So the logical deduction was that men had bigger heads to contain a bigger brain. Therefore, women did not have the capacity, the physical ability to deal with the complex issues of the state. Therefore, they should not have the vote. Okay? Now, yeah. So, they also measured the hips and found that women were wider in the hips and men were smaller in the hips because women were supposed to be having babies, and so God gave them big hips and small heads. Okay? Now, we learned through time that the size of the brain has very little to do with the intelligence, and but eventually, I mean, look how long it took them until 1928 to finally get the vote. It took them a long time to overcome that. But that's the essential, simple logic that has been used inappropriately for political movements. Same thing happened with carbon dioxide. You see a rise in carbon dioxide, you see a rise in temperature, you assume that one caused the other. I'm going to give you a little head start on something that shows up later on. Rise in carbon dioxide does not cause the rise in temperature, it's the other way around. Temperature rises, then carbon dioxide rises about 600 years later. That's what science showed us in 1995. But the global warming argument had already gone so far out of the station that they had to hold on to that notion that rising carbon dioxide was going to cause global warming. Now here's an important player in the whole thing, Gustave Le Bon. He was a French social psychologist who developed the notion of crowd psychology. He published a number of books. One of the primary theories of his is that there's an unconsciousness that affects your behavior depending on what the crowd is doing. So in other words, a person takes account of the behavior of the other people that are around them and then will orient their behavior depending on what everybody else is doing. It's also called the sheep effect. The number of psychologists were looking at it. But his work on crowd psychology was picked up by President Wilson and also by Joseph Goebbels to promote and develop the whole issue of propaganda. So crowd psychology becomes a major component in global warming. You look at these big rallies and everybody's saying, you know, stop global warming and so on and so forth. I have talked to these people and I find out that they are catastrophically ignorant to even the most simple basic facts about climate. For example, what is the dominant greenhouse gas? Water vapor, I already told you. You go out and you talk to some of these guys who are pushing the Al Gore side of it, and they'll say carbon dioxide, or they'll say methane. What is the dominant source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Source. He says trees, forest fires. Nope. Exhalation of the animals is the closest. It's called primary production. All of the animals, mostly bacteria, yeast and things like that, the exhalation of carbon dioxide is the primary source. What is the second strongest source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Geologic, you're close. What it is it's called soil respiration. It's all the dead stuff off-gassing. Now, what is the dominant source of carbon dioxide that is anthropogenic? The human-caused carbon dioxide. What is the single largest source of human-caused carbon dioxide?
Washington.
Third world home fires. Third world home fires. Which it creates kind of an interesting conundrum because the United Nations wants the Western world to pay carbon taxes to compensate the third world. You'll see how this develops later on, how this thought develops. But they've got it completely backwards. If you took the premise that carbon in the atmosphere is causing warming, the United Nations should be taxing the third world to compensate the SUV drivers in California because we have such clean operating machines. To help us pay for, well, like my new truck. I just got a new truck, and so I need somebody to help me pay for that. So I want those villagers in the middle of Africa that are burning down the forest and putting all this carbon in the atmosphere, I want them to give me money to help me pay for my clean truck. All right, down the road. More on, I can try. Crowd psychology again, Max Weber, German guy. He starts forwarding the democratic nationalism that starts to take hold in Germany. There are certain people in Germany that like that idea, but the problem is they don't like the Jews. his party with democratic nationalism came out of, it was populated with a lot of Jewish people. And so it didn't go very far. Matter of fact, he was killed. Now, early progressives. Major progressive, Woodrow Wilson, he was a progressive, he was a propagandist, and he was also a racist because he believed in eugenics. He felt that Eastern Europeans, especially Eastern European Jews, were an inferior race. He felt that blacks were an inferior race. He felt that homosexuals were inferior, and so on and so forth. And he felt that through selective breeding that they could improve the population in the United States. There's also George Bernard Shaw. You may have heard some of the famous quotes from him about bringing in euthanasia so that you can humanely get rid of all of the undesirable people.
I wonder if he ever looked in the mirror.
Well, there's some deep irony there we can talk about, like Hitler had a grandfather that was half Jewish. Now, he started using a new technique very widely called propaganda. And I can talk for 2 days on propaganda, but essentially here, these are the main elements of propaganda: the word games, false connections, testimonials, and transfer. You ever hear Al Gore say, well, don't take my word for it, look at all of these scientists. That's a propaganda technique called transfer. Special appeals to the plain folk, getting on the bandwagon. You see a lot of that in global warming. Logical fallacies. Carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up, therefore carbon dioxide caused global warming. Ad hominem attacks. You ever hear the term denier? Okay. I think I've got something on here later on that, but I'll save it for later. Ad nauseum, tireless repetition. Global warming, carbon, and on and on. We're getting a lot of that. One of the key pushers of that notion was Edward Bernays. And he felt that manipulation was necessary in society. He wrote a number of books that were used to forward the progressive agenda in the early years. In 1920, after the First World War, Wilson starts to push the notion of a League of Nations, where all the nations come together, and they're starting to forward this notion of a controlling global world governance kind of thing that would be done through the League of Nations. League of Nations had all sorts of problems, but I won't go into that. Critics of socialism started coming out. We had people who were able to look at what was happening with the communists in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, what the progressives were saying about social justice and so on. One of the biggest voices in that was Friedrich Hayek. He pointed out that social justice is really vaguely defined, especially in the way it was used by the Marxists. He said that it becomes an instrument of an ideological intimidation. The purpose of it was for gaining power through legal coercion. It had much less to do with principle of what is fair and what's right, and a whole lot more to do on power. Not virtue, but power. So it was very, very powerful statements. But this was on the opposite of the socialist side. Now, Bernays' work was picked up by the social progressivism that developed in the following the First World War in Germany with the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This was a poster that was put up in the early 20s, and I'll translate it for you. It says 60,000 Reichsmarks. This is what this person suffering from hereditary defects cost the community of Germany during his lifetime. Fellow citizen, that is your money too. Now, are you picking up any similarities about what's being talked about there? Yeah. You, sir, you're 75 years old. You're not contributing to society anymore. Therefore, we are going to deny you certain types of health care because you're not contributing to society anymore. This showed up in the Tom Daschle book, Critical, which Sarah Palin picked up and came up with the notion of the, what do they call them, the death panels? Yeah, that, everybody said Sarah Palin was crazy. Well, she read Critical, and it was Tom Daschle's book where he came up with the notion of denying health care to older people because they're not contributing to society. They take too much of the health care budget. We have to redistribute it to the people who are younger. That is a progressive notion. It's not a Sarah Palin notion. She just observed it within the progressives. Now that was forwarded by this guy. Talking about spooky dudes. This is Joseph Goebbels. Now in 1931, they started, again, this progressive movement in Germany had already been going for about 10 or 12 years. And so they started coming down on some of the free thinkers, one of whom was this guy, Albert Einstein. There was a pamphlet that came out from these Germans trying to put him down because Albert Einstein was Jewish. They said his theory of relativity was a bunch of bunk. Now Einstein said they didn't need 100 scientists to prove him wrong. All it took would be one. But none of those 100 scientists actually proved him wrong. The same thing is happening with global warming, where they talk about all these thousands of scientists out there, who, by the way, very few of them are climatologists. Most of them are sociologists and political scientists. All you need is one to prove them wrong if scientific empiricism is going to be followed appropriately. Now, going back to the global warming thing, Milankovitch, with a bunch of paper and a great mind, started calculating the movement of the planets and the sun and the other things in the universe. And he was calculating that the rotation of the Earth had more to do with climate than anything in the immediate atmosphere. He pointed out that you have a thing where you have orbital eccentricity. The Earth does not go around the sun in a perfect orbit. It has an ellipse where there are times when the Earth is closer to the sun than it is at other times. Now, got a question. If you've got a source of heat, are you going to feel warmer if you're closer to the heat or if you're farther away? Do you think maybe he's got an answer to what's causing climate change? He also has a thing with the tilt or the obliquity. That has to do with the tilt of the Earth. If the Earth is more towards a perfect parallel orbit or parallel axis to the sun, the tropics are wider. Tropics being that area of the Earth that receives the same amount of energy from the sun, or the same amount of sunlight. And so if the tilt changes, tropics get narrower. So that area of the Earth that gets a constant amount of sunlight is reduced. And you end up with longer winters at the poles. And so as you rotate back and forth, you have changes in climate because the length of the winters are longer or shorter. Then also in precession, you've got a thing where you've got a wobble in the Earth where it goes around like this. So you've got the orbit, you have the tilt, and you have the wobble. And there's some other things that we don't have enough time to go into, like the ipsilateral precession, having to do with the combination of all those elements and so on. But essentially, in the mid-1970s, where they're starting to get some sea-core proxy information on the paleoclimate, they found out that Milankovitch really got it right. He knew exactly what was going on. What they were getting out of the sea cores was proving it to be right. Well, meanwhile, in Southern California, the modern era of climatology begins with a guy named Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle was an oceanographer. He was identified as the first director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and his primary job was to get money for the institution. So what he did is he found some information about carbon dioxide and said, you know what, we need to study carbon dioxide. He hitched his wagon to this guy Zeus, and they wanted to consider if the excess carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels might be exacerbating a greenhouse effect. He didn't say that it was. He said, give me money so I can study it. So also in his group, a fellow by the name of David Keeling was making observations that the residual carbon dioxide of the atmosphere was actually rising. So Revelle got more money to establish the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide measuring station in Hawaii, And so this is what's known as the Keeling curve, which was used quite a bit by the global warming advocates. Now, one of the big problems with this is that it started in 1958. Now, if you remember from those earlier things I showed you, the climate change is on a millennial scale, not a decadal scale. So you can very easily pick up a trend like that in a very narrow period of time, and you can calculate arithmetically that it's going to be going way up there. All right? You have to go back far enough in time to see the changes so that you can predict those changes. If all you do is take a period in which it's going up vertically, it's just going to be going up to the sky. Now, in the 1960s, NASA is reporting that, guys, we're observing a downturn in temperature. We're not seeing a rise in temperature. We got to get off this global warming kick. We got to start being concerned about the cold again. But over at Harvard, we've identified this as the birth of a movement. Roger Revelle was teaching there, and he had a class in weather and climatology, and he had a particular student who was the son of a U.S. senator. And this son of a U.S. senator got really excited about it and said, whoa, global warming, that's totally cool. That's far out. Of course, that particular class member got a C grade in the class, and he failed the only other science class that he had at Harvard. But then he ends up being the biggest mouth to promote global warming. That's Al Gore, if you haven't figured it out yet. Of course, that's him. That's Tipper, and that's Al when they were at Harvard. Well, on the political side, in 1966, a new concept called the orchestrated crisis is forwarded. What had happened, you had the Watts riots in Los Angeles, and there was a lot of concern on the progressive socialist side that the reason we had this racial unrest was because of poverty, and the only way that we could overcome the poverty is to go back to the roots of the early socialists that were talking about a utopian society that redistributed wealth. The problem was you had a very wealthy capitalist society and you had the poorer class. How do we get into a socialist situation so that we can redistribute the wealth and make everybody happy as clams at high tide? Well, he came up with this notion of the orchestrated crisis, that what you needed to do was create a very great crisis. Create it, in other words, it's not an actual crisis, you just create it. And then what you do is you get the government to commit its resources and promises to deal with the crisis. But then you start to promote that crisis, and in the process of promoting the crisis, you end up bankrupting the government, and it all collapses. Okay? That's called the orchestrated crisis that came out of this cat, Richard Cloward, which is now being forwarded further by Francis Fox Piven, who ended up being his wife after a while. He's one of these professors who married one of his students, you know. A lot of people don't know that. But I can go off on a tangent right now that will curl your toes, that will show you that the economic crisis we have right now came out of that notion of an orchestrated crisis, with a thing called the Community Reinvestment Act. And did you know that there was an attorney in Chicago who sued the 5 largest banks in the country because they weren't following the tenets of the Community Reinvestment Act back in 1994? And that caused the government to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act is what was removed in 2000. 2000 is when it was removed. And that led to the economic crisis we have right now. Who was that attorney in Chicago back in 1994?
Obama?
Yeah, Barack Obama. That's a whole nother story. I can talk about that for an hour, but we're talking about weather and climate right now. Another cat in the whole picture is a guy named Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong was a socialist out of Canada. His father and his mother were socialists. He was schooled by the leading socialist writer in Canada at the time. He grew up during the Depression. He felt very strongly that the poor people needed to be taken care of by the government. Well, Murray Strong hooks up with the UN. Very early on, he develops this notion of a one world government being managed through the United Nations. And his orchestrated crisis is the environment. So he establishes something called the World Earth Day, which comes up in the next slide. And so in World Earth Day, he devises the concept that the United Nations could demand payments from the Western world to be redistributed to the third world and the developing countries. Now in 1971, after that, we end up with this guy, John Holdren. Everybody know who John Holdren is? This is a scary fellow. He proposes that we are coming into a cold period that is being caused by human beings. In other words, the global warming thing started to change because the science or the direct observation was showing us that it was starting to cool. So he starts to say, well, the cooling is being caused by human beings, and the way to deal with that is we need to put sterilization drugs in the water supply so that they can stop breeding. Now that didn't happen because he was concerned that that water, or the sterilization stuff, would get into the broader water supply and diminish the food production in the form of cattle and swine and so on and so forth. And so that never went. But this guy wanted to stop breeding in the United States to reduce, or in other countries too, so that you would reduce the total population so that we could save the world. He felt that there would be a sudden slumping of the Antarctic ice cap induced by the added weight, and it would create tsunamis and people would die, and oh man, I tell you, crazy guy. This is where it was published. Anthropogenic cooling is bad. 1972, Maurice Strong is starting to push his global warming thing again. The problem was there were more concerns over global cooling than global warming. Maurice Strong had already committed to the notion of carbon dioxide and warming, and he wasn't about to abandon it, so he figured he'd just be patient. Everybody else was concerned about anthropogenic global cooling. Maurice Strong was worried about anthropogenic global warming. After Stockholm, Maurice Strong gets this notion that, well, let's not call it social justice, because those words are attached to Marxist communism. He's going to change it, and he's going to make it economic justice or environmental justice. Still the same notion, but he just put a different little twist on it. The entire purpose of this, of what he was doing after the Stockholm Conference, was that mankind's whole work and dedication must be towards the ideal of a peaceful, habitable, and just planet. It goes back to what that guy said a couple hundred years earlier about social justice and making everybody equal and so on and so forth. It's all the same stuff. And again, he strongly suggests a toll or levy could be based on the use, misspelling there, the use of fossil fuels. Now he's making the link with fossil fuels. He establishes an organization called UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. Maurice Strong becomes the first head of it and starts pushing the notion of using an international or an intergovernmental panel on climate change as the venue through which you can prove that the Western world is ruining the planet. Then the United Nations will charge the levy, and then he will distribute it to all his buddies in Africa. Now, one of the problems with the global warming camp, 1975, the coming ice age, published in Newsweek. Everybody's worried now that what the New York Times says, a major cooling of the planet is widely considered inevitable. Climate's been getting cooler since 1950. So they're worried about global cooling, then global warming, and then global cooling, and now they're worried about global cooling again. 1975, John Holdren speaks up again. Remember, he first showed up in 1971. So there's so much ice in Antarctica that will cause tremendous tsunamis. He proposes forced abortions, not just sterilization drugs. He wants forced abortions to control the population growth of less desirables. Who does that sound like? Goebbels? Hitler? This guy is your science czar. Okay? He wants forced abortions to control the population growth of less desirables. He suggested fertility drugs again. Anyway, get off of him. He's a bad guy. 1983, the Reagan administration says you guys are full of hooey. 1985, you get a village conference. This is where Maurice Strong is now trying to get international agreements to restrict emissions. So he's now onto that whole fossil fuel burning emissions kind of thing. He finally gets his IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He succeeds in 1986. The purpose of the organization is to assess on a comprehensive, open, and transparent basis the latest scientific, technical, socio-economic literature produced worldwide relevant to the understanding of the risk of human-induced climate change. Their goal is to prove it scientifically so they can start charging everybody. 1988, the IPCC gets cracking. They finally start figuring out it's going to take some money to get this happening. They come up with $250,000 grant from the Teresa Heinz, or the Heinz Foundation grant. Teresa Heinz Carey is the administrator of that. She gets Jim Hansen at NASA, $250,000 personal grant to put a scientific explanation on global warming. He also gets $980,000 of additional support. Want to put a scientific explanation on the warning. So in 1988, Hansen testifies in front of Congress. I'm not making this up. You can find this in the congressional record. And he's saying that the rising carbon dioxide is going to have these catastrophic effects. In his paper, he actually produces a graph that shows that in 20 years from the time that he does his talk, that the average global temperature should be 1.2 degrees centigrade higher than it was at that time, and that it should cause a high enough sea level rise that you should have Arctic transportation of ships and so on and so forth. 20 years to the day after his presentation at Congress, what was the temperature rise, the anomalous temperature rise over those 20 years? Anybody know? See, people don't know this. 0.01 degrees centigrade in 20 years. Okay? 1988, Revell starts to realize that what Al Gore's saying and what Maurice Strong is saying have kind of gotten out of control. They've taken a little bit of the science and they started to run with it, and they're getting completely out of control. He comes out and he says we should wait another 10 or 20 years to really be convinced about what's going on. Meanwhile, here's an example of the way arguments are being made to promote global warming. This is sea level rise, Chesapeake Bay, 1938, 1957, 1972, 1988, the same little place. More water here, less water there. The sea level is rising. The tide went out. No, something else went on here. This was actually used to promote concern about rising sea levels on the East Coast. No, well, focus on the water. Here's what was going on. You ever hear of a thing called the Ice Age? You ever hear of a thing called the Laurentide Glacier? The Laurentide Glacier was that big hunk of ice that was sitting over North America, all of Canada and most of the northern United States. When it melted, it became the Great Lakes. But when it was a great big hunk of ice, like 5 miles thick and pushing down on the earth, what it did is it created a bulge in the earth. Kind of like if you go to a beach and you're standing on the sand, and you stand on the sand and it bulges, you got the weight in the middle and the sand bulges on the side. Well, that's what happened here. That big Laurentide Glacier created a peripheral bulge around the glacier. When the glacier disappeared, that weight was gone, and so the earth in the middle started to rise, which is called PGR, post-glacial rebound, and so the bulge started to subside. So it created a phenomenon called peripheral bulge subsidence. So in this situation, the sea level was not rising, the earth was sinking. But this was a big argument for why we had to do something about global warming, because the sea level was rising back in 1989. This is a longer explanation of it, but I got lots to cover yet. 1990, the IPCC first assessment report came out. One of the big problems with it was that they were talking about how, golly gee whiz, the trend of sea level rise and temperature rise was completely out of control. We had to do something immediately. If we didn't, we were all doomed, and scary, scary, scary. The problem was their database only went back 120 years. They didn't include the 1,000-year or the 10,000-year range. They were just pushing what they saw in the last 100 years, which was, in fact, a warming period. But they were subjected to an awful lot of criticism by lots of different places. One of the criticisms came from a group of meteorologists up in Oregon that produced a letter called the Oregon Letter, where they said that the IPCC is full of hooey. That one, they're saying they're making predictions based on computer models. You cannot make predictions using computer models. You can show scenarios, you cannot make predictions. And they said a number of other things, but later on in that year, when the first IPCC report came out at the Bohemian Grove, word comes out from John Coleman that Roger Revelle says, the topic is so important. Let me see. Revelle was invited and delivered a lakeside speech, and he apologized for turning Al Gore loose, essentially. 1991, Revelle with two others, including Chauncey Starr and who was the other guy? Fred Singer. And they put an article in Cosmos saying that they're reaching a little bit far on this whole global warming carbon dioxide thing. They need to back off a little bit. Revelle was now certain that CO2 was not a problem. Remember Chamberlain and Angstrom back 90 years earlier? All right, they came to the same conclusion. So now science goes through all its machinations and they come to the same conclusion again. That carbon dioxide is not a problem. It does not cause global warming. Well, the problem was Revelle died 3 months after that thing was published. Al Gore was asked about how he felt about what Revelle was saying, and he said it was the actions of a senile old man. My respect for Al Gore hit a new bottom. The Rio Earth Summit, 1992. Again, Maurice Strong is the Secretary General for that, and was pushing the idea further about coming up with standards for charging the countries so that they can redistribute the wealth. In 1992, things started heating up. There was more conflict. You guys can read all that. Again, I've got so much I want to cover. Criticism is starting to mount further. People are raising the question about the medieval warm period. What are you guys saying about it? The last decade is the warmest in all of history. What about the medieval warm period? You didn't even consider all of the tremendous science that showed it was warmer in the medieval warm period. Not just climatology, not just direct observation, but how about entomology? What's entomology? Study of bugs. How can you use bugs to determine if an area is warm or cold? Certain bugs will not survive in super cold weather or in super warm weather. So you've got a whole bunch of different kinds of bugs, and you can actually track the bugs as things warmed up in Greenland and then cooled off again. You can even look at archaeology and literature. There were letters that went back and forth between the King of France and the King of England, talking about how the climate was changing and how the guy in France was concerned that England would be able to grow grapes now every bit as good as what they had in France. Okay. You had the Norse sagas. All of this literature was saying the medieval warm period was warmer than it is now. Yet the IPCC said, well, don't tell us about that because it doesn't fit into our agenda. The Oregon Letter again. John Christie, who was one of the lead authors and one of the main guys at the IPCC, said, you guys are messed up. What happened was they pulled together the scientific information, and then a group of bureaucrats headed up by Maurice Strong said, but we'll take this piece, and we'll take this piece, and we'll take this piece over here, and we'll come up with a summary and a conclusion, but we won't tell the scientists what we did. Then they take all of the scientific papers. You might have heard this thing about 2,500 of the world's leading climatologists agreed with what the IPCC was saying. Well, they took all of the papers that were used as references for the response in the study, and they copied all those names and put them on a list saying that all of these scientists agree with where the IPCC is going. That is where that came from. John Christie, a guy with ethics, said what the IPCC was doing was an immoral academic fraud. Of course, now we start hearing more dire warnings. We're getting to this is Marie Strong again. We're getting to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrial civilization to collapse. You see how this is kind of coming together? See where the roots of this is? Has nothing to do with protecting the environment and everything to do with promoting socialism. National Academy of Sciences starting to say that you've got to get away from the collective bias or the intrusion of dogma, because that's starting to get into the scientific results. That's not a good thing. 1995, group of people, 9 of them actually, completely unbeknownst to the rest of the scientific world, say, we need to get rid of the medieval warm period. Honestly. Remember those emails that got leaked a year ago last week? One of the emails, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. It dilutes the message rather significantly. Okay? I'm going to take you into part 2. McIntyre Man and the medieval warm period. And he says that if you start looking at these tree rings closely enough, you can find a warming signal. So he publishes a paper very, very quickly in 1995 that said the medieval warm period actually included the coldest year of the millennium. Really? 1997, 1999, history changes. This guy, Michael Mann, shows up using dendrochronology data fed to him by Keith Briffa on just a handful of bristlecone pines, comes up with what become known as the hockey stick, the Michael Mann hockey stick. In his hockey stick, he finds out that, oh golly, look, we're really warm up here. There's no medieval warm period. Ta-da, look, medieval warm period is gone. So apparently history can be changed. They start coming up with, trying to support what they did with the bristlecone pines. They start looking at some trees up in the polar Urals. These are the trees they were looking at. Briffa and colleague Schweingruber run a big data set on all these trees, and they can't support what the bristlecone pine stuff is saying. So rather than publishing that data, they simply dropped it. They never submitted the paper because it didn't support the agenda. All right, if it doesn't fit, you get rid of it. Basic scientific premise. In 2001, the IPCC, the third assessment report comes out, and it adopts the Mann-Bradley-Hughes, MBH's Mann-Bradley-Hughes 1999 paper wholeheartedly. They mention it 6 times. And they talk about, my gosh, look at this. This is the problem. Oh, everybody's got to be scared. We've got to do something about that. The governments and the NGOs adopted DATAR as an unassailable gold standard to the state of the climate. We are warming. We're out of control. We got to do something really quick or all we're going to die. Well, this group of 9 people at Hadley and also at Penn State, what they do is they say, okay, we need to create a larger scientific body of this stuff. So what we're going to do is, we've got Mann-Bradley-Hughes who published their paper. Now, next person in line, you publish a paper, and the rest of us will critique that paper and say how great it is. Then next year, we'll do the next person in line. You publish a paper using the same data, and the other 8 of us will say, yes, that confirms Michael Mann's paper. So for 9 years, every year, another paper came out saying the Mann Bradley Hughes paper was scientifically correct and everybody needed to do something about the effects of global warming. It was within a tight group. They're keeping up appearances, but a Canadian statistician, a retired statistician named Stephen McIntyre, takes a look at the Michael Mann paper and goes, how the hell did you come to that conclusion with the methods that you've described in your paper? Will you please share with me your data and your computer code so I can rerun it to confirm that you were correct? They ignored him, wouldn't do it. It's kind of odd. The standard in science is if you come up with a new hypothesis and a theory and your data, you have to make it available to other scientists to prove that you are correct. To not do so is scientifically immoral. Well, another fellow by the name of Ross McKittrick says, you know what, Steve? You're making a boatload of sense, and I don't understand why these guys aren't sharing with you the data. So what they do is they publish a paper in Energy and Environment, and this becomes known as the M&M, or the McIntosh and or McKittrick and McIntyre paper. And what they want to do is force man to come up with his data so they can test it. So they're suggesting corrections to the man et al. Rather than getting access to their data, what happens is they're immediately attacked as deniers of climate change. Enter in a fellow by the name of William Connolly. He's a member of what's called the Red-Green Alliance in Europe, where you have the green environmentalists and you have the red socialists. They create an alliance in a common goal. What his job is you've got to go onto Wikipedia and get rid of any reference of the medieval warm period. His signature shows up on no less than 5,200 Wikipedia articles that he edits and downplays the medieval warm period. Considered to be extremely immoral. Steve McIntyre puts together climate audit out of his own money. And what it is, it's a internet blog that's to be used by scientists to get the good science out. Within weeks after Climate Audit gets out, we get another one called Real Climate. Real Climate is run by the guys at the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia, and it is heavily underwritten by Tides Foundation through the Tides Center. Spooky dude. Okay? I could go on for a long time about how Tides Foundation and George Soros has his hands in this, but it's all about pushing progressive collectivism, the socialist agenda. Okay?
And they're behind the health care bill.
Yeah, they're behind. Yeah, that's again. It's a very strange, interconnected kind of thing. It has nothing to do with the environment or climate. It has everything to do with pushing the agenda. Now we come up with Naomi Oreskes, who in 2004 decides that she's going to publish a paper saying that she has reviewed all of the scientific literature available, and she says everything in the scientific literature confirms what they're saying about global warming and the warmth that it is now. Now those of us who are the skeptics, we're saying, how can you do that? Remember those first images I gave you about the sea level stuff that Rhodes Fairbridge and some of those guys did back then? She did not include that in her list. It was a completely bizarre paper.
She's a little-headed woman.
Years ago she couldn't vote. Now they're banking everything on her word.
Another person at Wikipedia, Kim Dabblestein-Peterson. She becomes an editor. And she starts editing a lot more of these things, pushing the global warming like we're all going to die. Journalist Lawrence Solomon uncovers modifications in the duplicitous nature of the dogma, including Connolly and Peterson. He goes public with it. Of course, in 2005, we get Al Gore's famous little movie, What's really bizarre about this, my respect for the Academy went out the window, and same thing with the Nobel guys, because this is so bizarre. What was really weird about this is that he's talking about Dr. Thompson's thermometer. Remember this? Doesn't that look like the hockey stick? Well, what he did is he took the hockey stick, he put somebody else on it, and then used the original paper to prove that Thompson was right. Okay? So it was this very bizarre circular logic that this guy was doing. All he is a mouthpiece for progressive collectivists. In 2006, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences takes a look at it, and they say, well, yeah, it looks like it's okay, but there are statistical shortcomings. Ooh, a crack starts to show up. 2006, there's another serious challenge. Wegman is considered to be, Ed Wegman is probably the leading statistician in the entire world. He was brought in on this thing. He took a look at it, and he says what appears to be compelling evidence, but the criticisms of McIntyre and McKittrick are indeed valid. Man's decentered methodology is simply incorrect mathematics. I'm baffled by the claim that the incorrect method doesn't matter because the answer is correct anyway. Where did that notion come from? Anybody? Saul Alinsky, the ends justify the means. All right? Saul Alinsky, Richard Cloward, all those guys, it's all part of the same push throughout the climate change movement. One more hockey stick. In response to the Wegman report, Briffa, Schweingruber, and a few others publish another paper saying that Wegman doesn't know what he's talking about, and the Michael Mann paper was indeed correct. The problem was they had already exhausted all of their publishing resources in other papers that they could control, and so they put it into the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which had very strict data archiving rules. Ross McKittrick wrote them and said, hey, can we get your data? We want to see if this is true. And they said, sure, you can have all the data you want. We'll give you the computer codes. We'll give you the whole 9 yards. McKittrick's going, whoa, that's new. Note the date on it, 2008. Wegman was pointing out that the guys at the CRU were starting to lose credibility. When this paper came out, The Hockey Stick Too Far, McIntyre found the trees that they actually used in the paper, and he named them. One is tyranny, and the other is freedom. I think it's freedom. But what was Liberty? Yeah, one of these trees was named Liberty, the other was tyranny. And he found out that they took this very large data set and they selected out just a few of the trees that showed a warming signal. McIntyre got a hold of the entire data set, and what he found out was what Briffa had used created this. If you went to the entire data set, you got this. In other words, flat and unremarkable. Global warming did not exist. The scientists that were pushing it cherry-picked their data to come up with this famous hockey stick graph that got so much play at the IPCC and in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. The truth of the matter was flat and unremarkable. So we're coming up on Copenhagen. This is 2009, last year, early in the year. What McIntyre and McKittrick did started to shake the foundation of global warming. Coming up at the end of the year was the Copenhagen Conference. At Copenhagen, what they wanted to do was come up with an international agreement. I have read the original draft, which is written by Maurice Strong, and it said that all of the signatory nations would be forced to participate in a scheme in which all international financial and energy transactions would be taxed by the United Nations, and that money would be used to compensate the third world nations, especially Africa, for a loss of dignity. It said that in the draft arrangement. In other words, they felt that Burkina Faso and Sierra Leone and the Congo and places like that, their loss of dignity is because we've been burning fossil fuels. Had nothing to do with the corruption and the weirdness that's going on over there. It was all because we are living a little bit better life than they are. Obama said that he was going to go and he was going to sign it. And so everybody was very nervous that this was going to happen, that they were actually going to get this agreement that was going to get Maurice Strong his ability to tax the Western world. Then, at the end of October, something real special happened. In the climate world, it had the effect of a thermonuclear explosion. Actually, it was November 19th, not the end of October. Somebody who works inside this building, I've got an idea who it is. I've got a friend in Canada who thinks she knows who it is. Nobody's figured it out yet. But that person found a hard drive sitting on a table. And it had a sticker on it that said, "To be destroyed." So he kind of gets the hard drive and he plugs it into his computer. And he realizes that it's all of the emails, all of the data, and all the scientific code that Steve McIntyre and Ross McKittrick had been asking for through the Freedom of Information Act in the UK to test the Michael Mann hypothesis. They had taken this information off of the servers, scrubbed the servers, put it on a hard drive to be destroyed. This guy on the inside, somebody with integrity, took that information and posted it on a server in Russia, and then sent out a set of emails to well-known skeptics in the world, like Ross McKittrick and McIntyre and Anthony Watt and me and a bunch of other guys that were sort of in this group of skeptics. Started reading those things. We found out that the entire Michael Mann paper was an absolute fraud. What they found out, all of the modeling was done ignoring what the real data was saying, what the real observation was saying. The emails were found to be authentic. First thing we heard when it hit the media was that they got hacked into. Well, they found out it was not hacked into because their firewalls were all protected. This came from the inside. So it was released, it was not hacked. The CRU director, Chris Jones, has to take administrative leave. Oresky's paper is found to be biased because the players are all at CRU that were involved in the scientific papers that she was involved with. Mann, Briffa, Jones, and others were found to have orchestrated boycotts of scientific journals, writers and scientists, while refusing to reveal their own data and methodology. Associated Press environmental reporters found to have worked with the guys to put out false information through the wider media. The Copenhagen Treaty completely falls apart. It fails because this one guy decides to do what the right thing is to release the emails and expose the fraud that was happening in the climate change. Complete failure. Now, I can either start answering some questions or I can start showing you some other stuff that's really cool. Got any questions? What do you want? You want me to shut up? Are you tired of hearing me talking?
10 till 8. We close at 8.
Okay, I'm going to try to get through this real quick. Let me see if I can give you some really cool information. Yeah, the California AB 32. That is scary. That is absolutely scary. I could talk, if you want to invite me back, I can talk all about that. But I want to point out some other stuff about this guy. President Obama brings in this guy, the guy who wants to have forced abortions, and he says, or Obama says, the truth that is promoting, the truth is that promoting science isn't just about providing resources, it's about protecting free and open inquiry. It's about ensuring the facts and evidence are never twisted or obscured by politics or ideology. Now, all of a sudden, for this dude, it's all about global warming. Now, over the last 10 years, it hasn't been warming. We're actually in a very cool signal. And so he changed his tune again. Now, he already talked about coming ice age. Then he talked about uncontrolled global warming. You know what it is now? Climate disruption. What is climate disruption? It's weather. Now, Carol Browner, Director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Policy. She was with Socialist International and the Commission for a Sustainable World Society advocating global governance. When she got hired by the Obama administration, that website was scrubbed of any reference to Carol Browner. When people like to call me a denier, I say, you must be a Browner shirt. Now I can use the term brown shirt because of Jerry Brown. He's behind all of this too. She was a lobbyist for George Soros, Center for American Progress. Blown predictions. 88, James Hansen, he was wrong. 2007, BBC, Arctic summers ice-free by 2013. Ain't gonna happen. Remember what Obama said? Judge me by the people with whom I surround myself. He is a progressive collectivist. If you don't know what that means, look it up.
He says he's not.
He says he's a progressive collectivist? All right, who was the first person to use the term progressive collectivism? Karl Marx. Where are we right now? Rising sea level? Don't think so. The rate right now of sea level rise is 1.5 millimeters per year. And that rate is declining. 1.5 millimeters is 15 millimeters in 10 years, which is just under 6 inches in 100 years. Do you think we can adapt to that? Something that just came out today. There's a picture of what's going to happen to New York. Here they're talking about a 30-meter sea level rise. The actual science is showing in 100 years this much, but that rate is declining. This is present day, that's what they think. This is the propaganda that's going out right now. This is the actual measurement of the temperature in the high Arctic. Notice, except for 2 days right here, the temperature in the high Arctic never got above the 20th century average. Look, where the green line is the 20th century average. This is where it is right now. It's colder up there. I'm just getting good. Come on.
I know you are.
The Antarctic sea level or ice extent is greater than the average of the 20th century. There is more ice in the poles right now than before. The poles are not melting. The sun, then and now. That's the way it was when it was warming in the 90s. This is the way it is now. Notice the date on here, November 16th. Do you think maybe the warming during the 90s was caused by an active sun? Do you think the cooling that we're going into is caused by this? Here we've got a situation in which this is what the prediction is for the sun. The sun is not going to get up to where it was in the 1990s. In other words, we are going into a cold period. The climatologists are this close to naming this minimum. The last minimum they named was the Dalton minimum in the 1800s, in which there was great starvation and loss of agriculture. The one previous to that was the Dalton, was the Maunder Minimum, which is the Little Ice Age. Now we're engaged in doing absolutely stupid things. Remember that thing a couple months ago where everybody was supposed to turn their lights off for an hour? Okay, remember that? Well, that was a stunning success in North Korea. I mean, of all the countries in the world. You want to stop there?
Yeah, let's stop there.
Okay.
I know why I wanted